Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dan Lanning, the Oregon Ducks, continuing to work their way through spring practice. And up until this point, it's been, pretty tight-lipped. There's not been a ton of information or intel coming out from this program regarding what spring practice has looked like. But now that you are over halfway through this spring practice window, you are starting to get some buzz. You are starting to get a feel for some of the talent that is starting to emerge going into 2025. And I think what's so fascinating about this Oregon team, we've kind of been talking about this for the last couple of weeks. There's a lot of questions on this Oregon roster going into 2025. They lose a lot of NFL dudes that are going to be playing on Sundays next year. And so I think on the surface, a lot of the national media looks at Oregon and say they're going to take a step back. Although you have some questions about this roster, go look at this roster. Go look at the way Dan Lanning has used the transfer portal, recruited the high school ranks. There are a lot of potential answers that could emerge going into 2025. And I think I want to start this conversation on the defensive line. I don't think it's all that crazy to make a statement that this line could be better than the defensive line that we saw in the 2024 year. Now, there might be some people looking at me and say, you absolutely lost your damn mind. You lose Derek Carmen, you lose Jamari Caldwell, you lose a guy like Jordan Birch. In what way are you going to make the argument that it could be better? These year two, year three guys that have been slowly developing within this defensive line, I think there's a reason that Dan Lanning did not go out and add 3 or 4 names in the transfer portal on the defensive line. He added one in Bear Alexander. The rest, he said, hey, I'm confident in the guys that we've recruited out of the high school ranks. This unit you're starting to hear some buzz about kind of has me fired up going into the 2025 year. Want to talk about some names that have emerged throughout spring practice for Oregon. On the defensive line is where we're going to start. You're starting to hear some chatter about some other players as well. Before we do, and as always, to the Oregon fans, appreciate you guys. It's been really fun talking this team, and it's about to get real over the next couple of weeks, right? We got spring game coming up at the end of the month. We got that spring transfer portal window opening up in a week. We got Dan Lanning in Oregon starting to turn it up on the recruiting trail as well. Be a lot to talk about. The amount of support the Oregon fans have shown the boys, it has been amazing. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And let's start with this defensive line. Here's my overall take here. This unit, from a body type standpoint, it looks like the defensive lines that Georgia had under Dan Lanning when he was at Georgia. It's been a slow build up until this point, and I give Dan Lanning a ton of credit for taking over a defensive line that was really underwhelming when he took it over, consistently getting better over the last couple of years. You're looking for this defensive line to take another step going into 2025. Why is it so important? Because I look at it and say this is, I think, the key to win a national championship. You look at Dan Lanning at Georgia. Why did Georgia win 2 straight national titles? To me, it started with the defensive line. Michigan in 2023. Well, why did they win a national championship? To me, it started with the defensive line. And Ohio State, too, just won it. They had a very good defensive line as well. You look at the national championship teams, you'll look at good defensive lines. Now, Oregon had a good defensive line in the 2024 year. Can you be great in 2025? And it starts with the body types. This is a big defensive line. Bear Alexander, one of the smaller guys on the inside at 315 pounds. Amari Washington, I think, can take a massive jump going into year 3. You look at Jericho Johnson, he goes 340. Look at Tyrone Gray, he goes 345. Look at Terrence Green, he goes 340. Aiden Breland kind of getting the Brandon Dorless treatment. That's kind of an interesting storyline, by the way. Aiden Breland, I believe Coach Tuioti was like, we're kind of using him like we did Brandon Dorless a couple of years ago. A little bit of a smaller interior defensive line. And then that can kind of work out on the edge, can work at the 3-tech. Really excited about what year 2 can look like for him. I think the overall conversation probably starts, though, with your returning production in terms of Tatum and Mateo out on the edge. Now, it's frustrating for me because I feel like the national media talks about Mateo like he's the elite football player that he is. He gets his flowers. I feel like Tatum on the other side does not get nearly enough attention and credit for how good of a football player he is. And it starts with what he does against the run. Hey, I'm going to ask some Oregon fans, and look, if you're watching this on April 11th, you probably know a dang lot about this Oregon football team. And if I were to ask you, I'm saying this because I follow this team pretty closely, and I was surprised when I was doing a little research on this. Who led Oregon in run stops last year? That was a good front seven. Very good against the run. Who led them in run stops? It wasn't Bryce Betcher at linebacker. It wasn't Jeff Bossa. It was Tatum out there on the edge. He's an elite run defender. He's been an elite run defender ever since he got to Eugene. And then you look at the development he's had as a rushing the passer. 25 quarterback hurries, a 13.5% pass rush win rate. That edge duo in Eugene, Oregon, it's one of, if not the best in the country going into 2025. And then you look at some young emerging talent, a guy like Elijah Rushing. What can he do going into year two? You have the body types. And I know it's kind of body types aren't everything. But at the end of the day, let's not try to overcomplicate the sport. You're bigger, stronger, faster. You're probably going to be a better football team. And Oregon has the size and speed combination, that size athleticism combination that I think is impressive on this defensive line. Physically, this is the most impressive defensive line that we've seen Oregon have. Now you got to put it on the field in 2025. And then I think the other big storyline here, we're really kind of going nitty gritty into the defensive line, Bear Alexander, who I think can have a very similar impact the way Derek Carmen did in 2024. Derek Carmen, late addition to Oregon in the spring and going into 2024, I was like, I think Derek Carmen could be one of the better interior defensive linemen in the country. That's kind of what he turned out to be for Oregon in the 2024 year. I think Bear Alexander, that the potential is there because the flashes you saw from him at USC could be an elite football player. And everything you're hearing from Bear Alexander since he's gotten to Oregon is, one, ain't missing meetings, ain't missing workouts, ain't missing reps on the practice field. He's doing everything right. You get a Bear Alexander that for 8 months does everything right heading into a college football season, which we probably haven't seen from Bear Alexander during his career up until this point. You could be looking at a legitimate game wrecker for Oregon on the inside of the defensive line. I think this unit is deep. And from what it sounds like, the young talent that we need to step up is starting to step up. You look at one reason to say, hey, how does Oregon take that step? How does Oregon get over the hump in 2025? To me, it starts with this defensive line potentially being better than it was in the 2024 year. Another really intriguing storyline, wide receiver rotation coming together, and it probably starts with Dakorien Moore, right? And at the end of the day, we were all fired up about Dakorien Moore. I think there's a lot of Oregon fans that expect him to be one of, if not the best wide receiver in this room. And I don't think that's unfair expectations to put on this kid. But you wanted to start hearing that type of stuff in spring. Dante Moore got up there and said he's as advertised. The thing that stands out to me with Oregon in the wide receiver room is, one, speed. And you look at Dakorien Moore, he's a 10-4 guy. Malik Benson's a 10-4 guy. Evan Stewart, nobody talk about his long speed. He was a 10-7 guy coming out of high school. Kenny Sadiq at the tight end position, he was a 10-7 guy. They got some of the faster pass catcher. It might be the fastest pass catcher room in the country. We've been looking for Oregon to work the football down the field vertically a little bit more. Well, they have the speed and body types to do so. And I think what's fascinating about this wide receiver room as opposed to last year, there's probably going to be a little bit more rotation. Last year it was Evan Stewart, Tez Johnson, Trayshawn Holden. When those three were healthy, they didn't really come off the field all that much. This year, I think you could see a little bit more of a rotation because you have some unique body types. We get so stuck on this conversation of who's wide receiver one, who's wide receiver two, who's going to start, who's not going to start. I don't know if it matters as much going into the 2025 year. Kyle Casper with that big, long frame, he's got value to add in this Oregon offense, whether he starts or not. Jeremiah McClellan, one of the more all-around, more complete wide receivers in this room. Gary Bryan, a guy that when he's healthy, we know can play. Jurion Dickey has the traits to contribute to this wide receiver room in 2025 as well. There's maybe a little bit less of a clear starting three. And I don't think that's all that bad for Oregon. You got a lot of different wide receivers that can do a lot of different things well. Maybe one week when you're playing a team that you want to push the ball down the field, you're giving Malik Benson a little bit more burn. 1 week when you're playing a little bit more of a, hey, we want to attack the intermediate portion, Justice Lowe might play a little bit more. You got a lot of different wide receivers that bring different skill sets. I don't think you'll see as much of a rigid three-man starting rotation for Oregon. I think you're going to see a lot of names get an opportunity to contribute because they all, I think, can going into 2025. Dante Moore seems like the guy is probably the third thing. How he talks to the press. how the buzz you're hearing from the program. What I'm most excited about with Dante Moore is just him reaching his ceiling. Because if he reaches his ceiling, we did an episode last week and he can win the Heisman Trophy. There ain't no question mark about the talent that Dante Moore has. And what excites me the most, and I've kind of said this all offseason, one, it's by far the best situation he's been in. They threw him out there on a really bad UCLA team as a true freshman, made a lot of big time throws. You go back to the UCLA film, there's a lot of really impressive stuff from Dante Moore, but was in a bad situation, and you saw the inconsistency from a true freshman, not on a very good team, show up. Well, now he got a year to learn behind Dillon Gabriel, who is one of the most experienced quarterbacks we've seen play college football. He's been a year sitting and learning from a coach like Will Stein, who's a proven, very good developer of quarterbacks. And he's going to be in an offense that not only has way more talent around him than he had at UCLA, but it's going to be in an offense that gives him some easier stuff more often. And look, I think that the thing you're most excited about with Dante Moore in 2025 is he can do some more stuff than Dillon Gabriel could, but you probably don't want to ask him to make big time throw after big time throw like he had at UCLA. One of the things that I love most about Will Stein and his offense, we're going to give you some easy throws. We're going to give you the opportunity to really find a rhythm in this offense. It's not a coincidence that Bo Nix and Dillon Gabriel had elite completion percentages during their time at Oregon, because Will Stein's going to create an offense where a lot of stuff comes easy, and then kind of getting us over the hump. We're going to have you make some big time throws. Dante Moore can do that. Lastly, going to the secondary, and we're kind of bouncing all around here. The young talent's going to play. How much are they going to play? That's kind of to be determined. But Naheem Offord sounds like he is going to play, whether it's at nickel, whether it's at boundary, he's going to play. Ifio going into year two, he might be the best cornerback that you have on your roster. That's kind of what you're hearing coming out of spring practice. Well, look at Trey McNutt. I have him in the 3 deep right now. He very well could be a starting safety for Oregon in 2025 opposite Dylan Tiemann. And that's not a shot at Kingston Lopez. That's not a shot at Peyton Woodyard or Aaron Flowers. It's like Trey McNutt's just kind of a different caliber guy than Oregon's had in the safety room. It's a really fun combination where you have some guys that have been within this program that are some veteran guys. There's a lot of youth, but there's a lot more talent on this team than we've seen the past years. Now it's about, hey, how much of this talent can come together and put it together in 2025 at a young age is kind of going to dictate how good Oregon can be in 2025. But you are hearing all the right things about this Oregon team. I think the best way to sum up this team going into 2025 is there are more questions. The range of outcomes could be a little bit wider than you saw in 2024. 2024, we kind of knew this team was going to be good. Then the conversation was like, can we just put it together in the playoffs, which obviously didn't happen. This roster that we see, I feel very confident saying this, has a higher potential, has a higher ceiling than the roster did in 2024. There are more question marks, but I think that the ceiling is higher, and now you got to go reach that ceiling. Really excited. This is going to be a year where you're going to find out a lot about where we know this Oregon team is going in the right direction under Dan Lanning. This is going to be a year where I think you can really build. We'll see. Really excited about this team. Really fun. Really excited to watch the spring game too. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.